Is central banks the villains of the modern era? That is what we're going to break down today here on WFinance&Stocks. And we're going to use the framework from The Creature of Jekyll Island, written by Edward Griffin, 2010. And through using these models and reacting to a YouTube video about the creature from Jekyll Island, I will try to nuance the situation and give you the framework you need to understand what's really going on out there. Here, Tom Bilyeu is going to talk about the origins of the Federal Reserve and basically the premise of the book, The Creature of Jekyll Island. And I will react to the video.
True story. 6 men representing 25% of the world's wealth meet on a private train. No last names, no press, no records. If anyone asks, they're going duck hunting in Georgia. But they're not going duck hunting. They're building a bank, a private one that prints money out of thin air and loans it to the government for a fee, interest charged on every dollar. This is the true story of how modern banking was born and inflation along with it. This is the story of how your savings get siphoned, how every boom and bust for the last 100 plus years was scripted to move wealth from the poor and middle class to the wealthiest few in a system hidden in.
So this is a USA perspective. Actually, central banks was already the 1600s in Europe, in, for example, Sweden, and the Bank of England were created. So the Federal Reserve in 1913 was quite far behind in terms of being first, but they approached things a bit more aggressive, a bit more differently. And how this whole story is coming up here is quite intriguing. Let's go.
Plain sight. What they created is the foundation of our broken financial system. They created the Federal Reserve, and it changed the world forever. This is the ultimate thriller, the real-life story of how the system became rigged against us all, and the man who exposed it by writing one of the most dangerous books of the 20th century. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And if you've never heard of this book, that means that the bankers and politicians are doing their job. Like the Matrix, you're not supposed to see it. Merely live inside of it. Countless people recommended G. Edward Griffin's masterpiece to me as I tumbled down the rabbit hole of how money actually works, but nothing prepared me for actually reading it. It is a masterclass on cause and effect that attempts to map the modern economy from its inception on Jekyll Island through to today. I really doubt that history is going to remember The Creature from Jekyll Island as being perfectly accurate, and there's no doubt that at times it strays from the details of what's provable conspiracy into the lane of conspiracy theory, but I've yet to find a model that has higher predictive validity. Here's the core thesis of Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island. The modern economy is like a computer system with a precisely engineered flaw that creates a backdoor that allows its creators to reach into virtually any bank account in the world and steal money. Now, I have no doubt that that sounds impossible to you right now, but on behalf of author G. Edward Griffin, I'm going to make that case today, that the economic monster born on Jekyll Island is a machine designed to turn your labor into political control and banking profits. I'm going to outline exactly how the machine socializes losses across all of us, but privatizes profit for only a few. It's a machine that guarantees that bankers and politicians can't lose, and the taxpayer always picks up the tab. Heads, they win. Tails, we lose. Griffin calls our modern monetary system a bailout engine, where the goal is for banks to get bailed out. Having a fragile economy that needs to get bailed out is the very point. Now, if that sounds insane, it is, but it's also accurate, and I'm going to prove it step by step. So buckle up, because we're going to walk through how Griffin believes we were duped, how the machine works, and how we escape its clutches. And if you're like me, it's going to make you very, very mad, especially part 5, which is maniacal. Part 1, the birth.
So we can probably understand what we're heading here with the bailout machine, meaning that you build a system with a strong central bank, for example, the Federal Reserve in the United States of America. Then you have a system with a lot of banks. In USA, we have more banks, but some of them are obviously stronger. And if a bail fails, most of the time we're going to bail that bank out, because the system is built in a way that a lot of people will get crushed if the bank actually do not get bailed out, so to speak. And through saying that we're going to save the people by bailing out this bank, you can actually print money to save the banks and bail them out. And how can you do that? Because, for example, in USA, people do not really like to be taxed, and that is like almost a forbidden word. But when you instead print money to save the banks instead of raising taxes, people actually don't understand really what's going on. So you can just print the money, save the banks, and everything continue to work as nothing happened. Tom here continues to talk about how the Federal Reserve actually takes control and are a force that drives economic bubbles and boom and busts rather than being the entity that smooth them out. So if you have studied economics, you probably know that central banks are supposed to um, make the boom and busts and the depressions being a lot smaller. And through that, they are a net positive for the society as a whole. And they are using their main 2% inflation target to be that kind of organization that we can lean on, and that we build our modern monetary system around. But here we're going to see a different take from Tom.
Griffin argues that the Fed doesn't just control currency, it controls the story. And once they control the story, they don't need force. They just need you to believe or ignore. So they engineer ignorance. And they do it at scale through education, media, and the manufacturing of public perception. Griffin outlines how the Federal Reserve has carefully shaped the public's understanding of economics from the classroom up. Through partnerships with universities, grants to economics departments, and curriculum influenced by aligned institutions, the central bank's worldview becomes orthodoxy. Students aren't taught to question the insanity of inflation, they're taught to revere it. I, for one, believed until not that long ago that inflation was like a law of nature. I had no idea that it was man-made. And why wouldn't I? Or anyone else for that matter? Financial journalists often rely on Fed insiders for guidance and access. Critical voices are marginalized, and the Fed press releases are treated like gospel. Hopefully, the Biden cognitive cover-up is showing people just how actively the media works to lock people into a false narrative when they have an agenda. The public narrative around interest rates, inflations, and market stability is set by the very people pulling the levers. Even history is ripe for manipulation. As Griffin explains, it is constantly being rewritten to support the legitimacy of the current system. The cause of economic crashes are sanitized, the architects of collapse are framed as saviors, the real drivers, central banks, global financiers, colluding politicians, are almost never discussed in mainstream history.
And what I think here is the central banks is a tool, but probably the one main driver behind this is politicians, and that they want to be re-elected, so they spend too much money. And knowing that central banks are there as a tool to adapt to the system when countries has a big deficit spending, obviously the central banks will do their job that they are supposed to do, which is printing more money to make sure that the market do not get into a big depression. So they are doing their job they are supposed to, and they are controlled by the government, I would say. The Congress can actually change the main goals of the Federal Reserve. So these all things are connected to what we want. We want flexibility, and we want to being able, when we are in a crisis, when we enter wars, so when we need to solve problems fast, then we want the liquidity as a nation, and that is why we have basically allowed central banks to exist. So it's not that politicians are tricked by banks. I would say it's not overly complicated to understand the premises that we see here, and how balance sheet expansion actually works if we just take some time. And I sincerely hope that politicians do that.
Books. It's not that the truth is even that hidden. It's that it's never taught. One of Griffin's most unsettling claims is that the system creates its own opposition through false flags. By funding and promoting critics who stay within certain boundaries, the illusion of debate is maintained, but the fundamentals are never questioned. Central banking is never on the table. Griffin argues This controlled descent makes the system appear open while actually strictly reinforcing its boundaries. According to Griffin, fiat currency is not just a tool of commerce, it's a weapon of control. Price volatility creates anxiety, and fear makes people compliant, so inflation erodes your savings invisibly. The system steals your time and labor and slowly.
And obviously, when you write books like The Creature of Jekyll Island, you need that punchline. I would say an important thing here is that having inflation is a way to tax the people, and because the human mind has a hard time to understand compound interest and how much it really grows over time, it's an amazing way to just spend more money that you have and basically socialize all the losses. So that is the main driver, I would think. So I personally would not vilify central banks as much as the author do here, but obviously they have a key in everything here that's going on, and the banks who colluded and wanted this to happen, they understand the growth drivers, human psychology, etc., and obviously how they could make banks more powerful. So for them, it's a win-win.
But surely the frog is boiled. You don't have to jail a population to get them to comply if they're too afraid and too confused and too misinformed to act. The harsh reality is that central banks, like the Fed, encourage a move towards totalitarianism. Griffin points to historical examples such as Nazi Germany and even 9/11, where fear and the subsequent massive expansion of the.
So here I think we need some nuance. Every country in the world, basically, throughout modern times, has a central banks. Is every country a totalitarian state? Obviously, you can make an argue that every time someone became totalitarian states, they had a central bank, and they printed obviously a lot of money to fund their power, etc. But it's an easy case to do, and if you just try to turn some rocks there, I would say it's not super obvious that that is like the correlation here. Anyway, let's continue.
Money supply made increased governmental control not just possible, but desirable. The surveillance state made possible by the Patriot Act is a scandal from where I'm sitting, but here we are. And I trust I don't need to explain that Germany's attempt to meet the onerous demands of the Treaty of Versailles through money printing was a disaster. Given that it led to hyperinflation and the rise of Hitler, I hope we can all agree it was a terrible fucking idea, despite the desperate situation.
So the fault here isn't at the central banks, it's that the politicians that has been elected, dictatorships, etc., they are using the prospect of economic theory and a central bank to print money until they have a hyperinflation in the country. But I wouldn't say that specifically it's the creation of central banks that is the problem. It's the human psychology and wanting that power. So before central banks, we had like the debasement of currency. We had different types of notes, banking notes, etc. So all this is not anything super new that humans want to have more and fund something that we don't have money for. So this is a more sophisticated way to fund it. And obviously, I think it's very good that people like Tom here are talking about this, because then people understand that inflation is also sort of a tax, and they can be on high alert. And I think it's good also that people at the moment feels like they don't accept, oh, we have 2.8% inflation. That's good. They feel like they have problem to buy the things they actually bought 9 years ago. And the story arc that people are telling are not kind of connecting. And that is why people are frustrating, and also why I think these type of content are getting more usual out there.
That they were in. The pattern is predictable. A boom, a bust, a panic, then calls for control. Control of prices, control of wages, control of dissent. The centralization of power requires the centralization of money. Under a central bank, monetary policy can be used for the purposes of social engineering. When the Fed manipulates interest rates, it's not just tweaking the economy, it's redirecting human behavior. Cheap credit inflates housing bubbles, stock bubbles, as well as encouraging consumer debt and rampant speculative gambling, on any and every financial instrument that can be found.
So what happens if you are a totalitarian state but you don't have a central bank? For example, in China, they just went into the biggest companies, took a slice of their balance sheet, took it to the state, and continue like nothing happened. So there are always ways around that can make that centralized power continue to gain power in an unfair way. So sure, I think it's a very elaborated way here to connect the dots and also to break down why Western societies like USA ain't that much better than maybe totalitarian states, and that might be the key takeaway here. So
From NFTs and shitcoins to Beanie Babies and the Japanese yen carry trade, Griffin argues that human nature is to pursue speculative mania and that central banks exasperate this innate tendency. The example he gives is the Dutch tulip mania. As Griffin documents, tulip mania was a speculative frenzy that swept through the Netherlands in the 1630s, driving prices of tulip bulbs, of all things, to astronomical heights far beyond their intrinsic value. Ordinary citizens, merchants, and investors became gripped by greed, betting fortunes on flowers they believed would endlessly appreciate. Nothing ever does, so inevitably, the illusion collapsed overnight as buyers vanished and prices plunged, leaving speculators bankrupt and exposing the eternal truth that irrational exuberance disconnected from real value can bloom spectacularly, but always fades just as quickly.
And after watching this video, the question I want to ask you here today after watching everything is, who is the villain here? Is it the central banks? You have seen some shady stuff going on. Not everything is told. Why do we have a 2% inflation goal? Is it just for the public means, for everyday people, or is it a way to control us? What about money supply, bailouts, etc.? Would it be better if we did not have central banks, central planning, etc.? Is it a tool for dictatorship? I don't know. What I do know is throughout human history and the human psychology, we have always debased our currency. When Rome was the center of attention, they kind of did the same thing. Also, when they debased the currencies during the Kipper and Whipper in Germany, the 1600s, we did also see this kind of debasement. And more than debasement is this money printing, just expanding the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve and other central banks. And yeah, I would say it's probably some kind of combination here. The Federal Reserve is funded and created by private banks. Still, it's a very useful tool for governments to stay flexible in terms of crisis. For example, the COVID pandemic. When we have war, we have difficult situations, then we can stay flexible and use the quantitative easing to actually solve difficult problems. But the big problem with having this amazing tool that central bank is probably that it's very hard as a human to stay disciplined enough to use that tool correctly. So we always kind of print too much, and we get this unspoken problem that Tom are talking about here in the video, that we steal from everyday people, because inflation just do not feel like a tax in the normal sense, because it happens so slow and we are believed that it has to be. But when you have that compound interest year in and year out, actually a lot of your purchasing power is getting uh, erased. And I think we need to talk more about this and the system, how central banks works, and how politicians need to stay more disciplined in their way of execution. So I tend to maybe blame the short-term gains of the political the system as a whole, and I hope democratic nations can start to stay a bit more disciplined, because if we do not do that, the risk is that central planning, for example China, get the upper head, and we kind of steer towards more totalitarianism, etc. And that is not a state that I'm interested in living in. I want the freedom of pursuing my dreams the way I want, etc. So yeah, that's my take. I still think central banks is very useful, providing that liquidity for free society to expand, to use banks, etc., for smaller companies to get easy loans, and having that oxygen in the society. So I don't think you need to remove central banks, and if you do, the governments will find other solutions, like they do in China, to still get the money they need to fund whatever they need to fund. So what we need to do is put pressure through elections, that we need fiscal responsibility, and put more pressure in these type of questions. We don't want the governments to loan to finance everything. That's the main issue here, and maybe the 2% inflation goal and the existence of central banks might not be the main issue, according to me. And I still think it's very useful to have this type of what can I say, deep dives that we were provided here with the creature of Jekyll Island, to understand that everything is not black and white here. You need to have some nuance and understand that if we don't sometimes hit back, then we might get actually used by the system. So knowing this, you have a great tool going forward, and that is what I want to provide you with this YouTube channel. And hopefully you enjoyed. And if you do, please subscribe so I can continue to evolve and add more great content. So yeah, thank you so much for